Welcome to Panel 2, Housing as a Resource for Retirees and Those with Disabilities. I am your moderator, Tom Davidoff from the University of British Columbia. I reviewed 3 papers for this panel from Gary Engelhardt, Carly Urban, and Jason Fichtner. If you have a question as the talks go on for Gary, Carly, or Jason, please submit it via the Ask a Question button at any time during the panel. Okay, so we'll start with a little bit of a warm-up intro to the topic from me. The issue here is mostly housing and retirement, which is an area of perennial interest to people interested in household finance, because housing is so large in people's portfolios. And the fundamental problem was identified way back when in the mid-70s by Artel and Varaya, which is, your house represents the present value of dividend flows, the rental dividend and redevelopment options until infinity. But a retiree is only going to use that dividend for 20 or so years before they die or sell the home. And so the question is, how can the retiree use this wealth? They've paid for the infinity of dividends. They're only going to use 20. So is there a way for that retiree to spend some of the difference before they die or move out of the house without moving? That's reverse mortgage. That's very challenging. And so it's challenging from a contracting perspective because of all the moral hazard and adverse selection on so many dimensions. So handling the potential separation of ownership of the house and control of the house is potentially very important for financing retirement. And that problem of the gap between the infinity of dividends and the use or capacity of the owner shows up, of course, early in life as well, because to save enough so that the bank would be willing to lend and deal with the default option for workers, when the present value of dividends from the house may be very large relative to 30 years of earning power, again, it gets very challenging for most of the income distribution to own. That's not true everywhere. I think probably our panel has representatives from markets where that's more or less easy. But today's environment makes that difference between the infinity of dividend flows from the house and earning power or retiree use important, because of course we've got extremely low real interest rates. So the difference between a perpetuity and the years of life for a retiree or the earning years for a young house, that can be a very large difference. And that's especially true in markets like Boston or DC or San Francisco or Vancouver, where I am, where we would think that urban land growth is going to be probably very close to as large as realistic real interest rates, or bizarrely, growth could be bigger than a plausible long-run real interest rate. So that makes it very tempting for retirees to tap into their home equity because the gap between their use of housing and the asset is so large, and it gets very challenging for working renters to get into ownership or even to afford rents through their life cycle. And so luckily, we get to hear papers today on both the beginning of life and end of life. So Carly Urban with her co-author Hembre are going to talk about a very highly challenged group of working age households. And the question is in that paper, the second paper on our panel, is the link between SSI disability assistance and housing assistance vouchers. And there would seem to be a complementarity, because in some communities, you can get a housing voucher if you've got a qualifying disability, and getting SSI designation would help you get into that voucher queue. Interestingly, the authors seem to find substitution. That is, you either apply for SSI or a housing assistance voucher, which looks like it may be some kind of an income effect. And what really stands out in that paper, the second on our panel, is a very clever multi-difference identification strategy looking at all kinds of housing authorities through the US. So I think you'll find that very interesting on an empirical level. Both Gary Engelhardt and Jason Fichtner look for decumulation patterns. So at least since Venti and Wise, it's been this big puzzle. Well, geez, the elderly have so much home equity. Why don't they trade down, reverse mortgage? And when you look at data superficially, you seem to find very little decumulation of that home equity in retirement. And so they are going to enlighten us by looking at nursing home and hospice stays, because the last time you interview somebody in their home before retirement may provide a biased view of when and how home equity gets spent. And so we're going to talk to heirs. We're going to look at nursing homes and hospices, and the failure to spend home equity. I don't want to give anything away here, but maybe a little bit less puzzling than we thought, especially when households have large bequest motives. So some very interesting housing and retirement study data brought there. Jason Fichtner is going to talk about the multiple dimensions of home equity choice and how they move with the rest of the economy, with GDP and with interest rates. So we had this great financial crisis. We had a boom and bust in mortgage lending and asset values. And so that's going to affect how much mortgage debt retirees show up to retirement with. Also home ownership, because of course you might have lost some homeowners entering into retirement as the bust went in. And then of course, today we're at an extremely low interest rate environment and a very high home value environment. So that's sort of a stress test for this idea that people don't take out home equity. So it will be interesting to hear how refinance behavior moves with both asset values and interest rates. Another point Jason brings up is second homes are not uncommon among retirees, and that's another important form of housing equity. So with that, a little bit early, I will turn it over to Gary Engelhardt for our first paper on the panel.
Thanks, Tom. Along with the entitlements to Social Security and employer-provided pensions, housing assets are the largest in elderly portfolios. And as such, there's significant policy interest in the extent to which housing equity might serve as a form of a complement to retirement income for older individuals. And next slide. However, a longstanding issue in the economics of aging is the extent to which the elderly spend down their housing wealth as they age. In particular, a vast majority of studies find that the elderly do not withdraw equity from their houses. They do not trade down to smaller houses when they move. In fact, the only measurable reductions in housing equity occur when there are own-to-rent transitions. Next slide. This is somewhat of a puzzle because, as Tom pointed out, there are a lot of elderly households that are sitting on large amounts of equity but have relatively low incomes they could be supplementing. So overall, the elderly home ownership rate is significantly lower than would be implied by the simple forms of the life cycle hypothesis. And the question is why? And of course, there are myriad reasons why the elderly might hold on to their housing assets as they age. And that could be because of Medicaid eligibility rules, desire to age in place, bequest motives, tax strategies, insurance motives, etc. And what we're going to do in this paper is we're going to look at the impact of bequest motives on home ownership and to explore whether that's a possible explanation. So if homeowners want to bequeath a substantial amount of their wealth, housing is in some sense an ideal asset because it can serve multiple purposes at once, including as a store of value and as a vehicle for bequests. And this may explain why homeowners hold on to their assets so long when they may have sluggish demand for reverse mortgages. In fact, if bequest motives are particularly strong and not malleable, then effectively when thinking about housing equity, we might say that a certain proportion of the equity of elderly homeowners is effectively off the table because they've already allocated that towards bequest, and that will affect the way we think about housing equity as a resource for income in retirement. Okay, so next slide. Next slide. So what we're going to do is we're going to use data from the HRS. Next slide, please. We're going to use data from the HRS. Next slide, please. Thank you. We're going to use data from the Health and Retirement Study. We're going to use data from all cohorts. So as for those of you who don't know, the HRS is a nationally representative study of individuals that are aged 50 and older. They're interviewed every 2 years. Next slide, please. What's important is the baseline. The baseline for this study is all non-institutionalized individuals. So we start with individuals who are community dwelling, but we follow them every 2 years until death, including if they move into nursing homes, long-term care facilities, and hospices. And importantly for our purposes, upon death, the next of kin are administered an exit interview, which queries about the economic and health circumstances of the just prior to the individual's passing. Next slide. Next slide, please. And next slide, please. Next slide, please. Okay. We're going to begin by constructing the homeownership age profile. So this is, in the past literature, has been kind of a sufficient statistic for life cycle behavior. What the life cycle hypothesis would say is that the age profile of homeownership should decline essentially effectively to zero in the absence of uncertainty of the date of death. And what past studies have looked at this, and they found basically it doesn't decline. Well, the HRS allows us to follow individuals to really advanced ages. So this is what the age profile of homeownership looks like if we look at all individuals in the HRS pooled across all of the years. So you can see that homeownership rate peaks in the early 70s at about 70%. In the 80s, well into the 80s, it's still quite high. It does decline with age, but even among 90-year-olds, it's quite high. It's around 30–40%. And among centenarians, it's still high. It's between kind of 15 and 25%. So even individuals who are living to be very old are not fully accumulating their assets. Next slide, please. Now, that's the top line in that figure. Now, one of the, go back a slide, please. So that's the top line in that figure. Can we reverse, please? Thank you. Now that top line in the figure is what we typically measured in household surveys. It's living individuals who are community dwelling. So you'd measure this in, for example, the CPS. Now we're going to add back into this in a methodological contribution. We're going to add back individuals who, at the time of the interview, happen to be in a nursing home, long-term care facility, or hospice. And we're going to want to add back in their home ownership as well. So let's move forward 2 slides, please. So one more slide, please. Thank you. The short dashed line in this figure shows the proportion of individuals who are in one of these alternative living arrangements, that is nursing homes, long-term care facilities, or hospices. Not surprisingly, it rises with age for individuals who are in their 90s. About a quarter of those individuals are in those facilities when they're interviewed. And some of those individuals still own homes. About a quarter of those individuals at younger ages own homes. That's the long dashed line in the figure. And that falls to about 16% of individuals who are at the really older ages. So we're going to want to add those individuals back in. Next slide, please. And when we do, the homeownership age profile moves from the solid line to the long dash line. Next slide, please. Thank you. The red long dash line. So there's a lower homeownership at older ages. Then in the final contribution, what we're going to do is we're going to add back in what happens at the end of life. So in typical surveys, when you die, you attrit the sample, and we don't ever observe what happens at the end of life, but in the HRS we do with the exit interview. So we're going to add back in your home ownership in the last 2 years of life after your last living interview, but before your death at the exit, measured in the exit interview. And when we do, we get the short dash line in the figure. Now it's a little bit hard to see. If we move to the next slide, you can kind of see what the impact is of these adding in these two methodological expansions of the home ownership rate. You can see that relative to living community dwelling individuals, their home ownership rate, measured home ownership rates are significantly lower if we add in individuals who are in these other living arrangements, or individuals that we measure end of life behavior. In fact, among the oldest old, measured home ownership rates are about 12 percentage points lower if we add back these individuals in the HRS. So now let's go to the next slide, please. Next slide, please. So in the life cycle literature, age is a sufficient statistic to measure the life cycle hypothesis. But of course, the actual model of behavior is one that places restrictions on the time path of wealth as death approaches. So, and in reality, there's a distribution of dates of death, and many individuals die at ages that are not the oldest old. Next slide, please. This slide looks at shows you the empirical distribution of the age of death for all individuals who die in the HRS. And you can see that the bulk of individuals die before, kind of their mid 80s. And those are ages where the homeownership rates are still quite high. So what we want to do is we want to measure homeownership rates relative to death. Next slide. To do so, we construct, next slide, please. Next slide, please. We construct the homeownership relative to the date of death. So if you look on the horizontal axis on the right-hand side, 0 is the year of death, and if you move from right to left, those are years prior to death. You see the homeownership rate, even at death, is still among all households in the all individuals in the HRS, is still about 65%, and among the last surviving members, still about 50%. So what's the upshot? Next slide, please. The upshot is that a really large amount of housing assets are actually bequeathed. Next slide, please. So why are these assets bequeathed? Are these bequests intentional or unintentional? An unintended bequest from the contributor's perspective is one that occurs because you intend to spend the assets, you just die earlier than expected. So what we do is we model own to rent transitions, housing tenure transitions in a competing risk framework, and we look to see how much they move when bequest intentions move in the HRS. The competing risks are own to own transitions and dying in your home. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. And the upshot is that next slide, please. Our estimates suggest that having a modest bequest intention, next slide, please, of wanting to leave a $10,000 bequest raises the likelihood that you're going to lowers the likelihood that you're going to sell the home in an own to rent transition and spend the equity by about 23 percentage points. That's economically very substantial. This suggests that bequest intentions are a really important driver of elderly housing decisions. Now, as a last takeaway, we calculate what fraction of all housing wealth of the elderly is being held for bequest intentions. And we estimate across all households, it's 25%, and among unmarried households, it's about 55%. So essentially, a large fraction of housing equity held by the elderly is essentially off the table and not available for retirement consumption if bequest intentions are followed through. Thank you. Now we'll turn it over to Carly.
Great, thank you so much, Gary. I'm going to be presenting joint work with Eric Hembry, who's at the University of Illinois at Chicago. And as Thomas mentioned earlier, the name of the game today is really going to be policy complementarities. So next slide. What we're trying to look at, you guys don't need to read the full disclaimer, but it's there just in case you want it. Next slide, please. So for an example of policy complementarity among low-income populations, SSI recipients automatically qualify for Medicaid and SNAP and housing choice vouchers, or what I'm going to call HCVs for the rest of this talk, but they are disqualified from TANF most of the time. But of all of these different policies, housing assistance is one of the only ones that's rationed. So everyone who's eligible doesn't actually get it. And one thing that we found in just descriptive data is that disability status seems really important in whether or not you get housing choice vouchers. Okay, so among income eligible households with disabilities, they're 3 times as likely to receive housing assistance than those without disabilities that are also income eligible. And if you just look at a snapshot of all of the prime age household heads receiving housing choice vouchers, over a third of them actually have disabilities. So next slide, please. And you'll see in this map that it's pretty randomly spread across the country if you look at the county level variation in that statistic. So it's not just one specific region or area that has a higher fraction of prime age household heads with disabilities and housing choice vouchers. Next slide, please. So how are HCVs allocated? To deal with this oversubscription, local public housing authorities, or PHAs, manage wait lists based on 3 different types of systems. So the first is just a simple first come, first served. The second is a lottery. And the third is a preference-based system, which is basically a first come, first served, where you allocate points to certain groups and allow them to jump the queue. The most common is a preference in that list is household heads with disabilities. Next slide, please. So then in addition to different systems, there are different ways that PHAs manage waitlist. So they open and close them. Some of them always remain open, Some of them were closed for our entire 8-year sample period, so you couldn't even get your name onto a wait list in the entire period. And others open and close during our sample period, which is the most common allocation. And each time a waitlist opens or closes, it has to be advertised widely throughout the community. Next slide, please. So our basic question broadly is, how do we understand these policy complementarities? How do HCVs interact with other safety net programs, particularly for low-income populations with disabilities? And specifically, we'll be looking at SSI applications and awards, and then also TANF. Next slide. So we know from previous literature that SSI and DI are responsive to both economic conditions and programs, but no one has ever looked at the complementarity between SSI and housing assistance. Next slide, please. And in addition, we know a lot about HCVs, but all of this work is pretty much focused on either lotteries, where you randomize who got and you see who did and didn't get housing choice vouchers through these lottery systems in one city at a time, or through moving to opportunity experiments in 6 cities largely, where you move households from public housing to HCVs, which is again kind of a different thing. What we're trying to understand is what is happening with HCVs across the country and specifically in these preference-based systems. Next slide. So our contribution is really to document these disability preferences across the country, as well as try to understand these policy interactions in a nationally representative quasi-experimental setup. Next slide, please. So these policy interactions are kind of complicated, and ex ante, they are theoretically ambiguous. So my first thought in kind of coming at this project is that when PHAs are prioritizing these household heads with disabilities, that you see these waitlist openings, and perhaps applying for SSI is now more likely because people want to get HCVs. They think having SSI will increase the likelihood that they get it. They may also think of this as like a lower cost way of validating their disability through medical professionals before they apply for SSI, so then it would increase. There's also the possibility that because HCV benefits are so generous, and we're thinking like an average of $740 a month, and housing is the largest expense for most low-income populations, that, with the long application phase of SSI, during which you can't really work or it threatens your application, that actually opening these wait lists might increase the likelihood that you actually don't apply for SSI, at least in the short run. So we're gonna look at that, as well as this potential long run complementarity, where it could be that you're waiting until after you get your HCV to actually apply for SSI, and then we might see something down the road. Next slide, please. So one of the big contributions here is our massive data collection. So we contacted all local PHAs that service HCVs. There are about 2,100. We have responses from about 1,400, and there's no clear selection of the sample of respondents, which is good, but some of them did not respond to our calls, emails, snail mails, and sometimes in-person visits, which were fun. We collected whether or not there is a stated disability preference, again, for household heads or their spouses with disabilities. 48% of local PHAs across the country said yes. So less than half operate the other 2 systems, either first come, first serve, or lotteries. Waitlist, we also collected data on waitlist opening and closing dates. So every date they opened and closed the waitlist from 2010 to 2017. About a quarter always remained open, about 10% always remained closed, and on average, waitlists were open for 7 months. Again, that's including everything. For some, we also looked at whether or not, or how they verify their disability preferences. Next slide, please. And here's one example. You'll notice that in New York City, it's less rigorous than going through the SSI process. So you could document your disability showing hospitalization for a disability, or basically a letter from a health or service professional or a social worker. Next slide, please. So let me show you the data. The red in this map are places that have no disability preferences in housing assistance. The yellow are the opposite. So every PHA within the county has a disability preference. And in between are those where there are many or several PHAs within the same county. So it's a weighted average of those. You'll see that it mostly looks like this has just been sprinkled at random. right? So local PHAs get to pick their own policy, and with some geographic trends, can't actually see all the yellow in the middle of the country because it's not, the counties are too small, but it's pretty random. Next slide, please. We also show using HUD data that PHAs that say they have disability preferences actually have higher fractions of household heads with disabilities in housing assistance. So the first stage is actually there. They are actually, the composition is different. Next slide, please. Now, in addition, I told you we collected data on the number of months open. The yellow are counties where all PHAs were always open. The red is the opposite, no PHAs ever open. And a lot of them are going to be somewhere in between, with 0 to 3 months or 3 to 6 months of a year on average open. Next slide, please. So in addition to our hand-collected policy variation, we use data from the HUD picture of subsidized housing, so we can extract the number of HCV units by PHA by year. We also get data directly from the SSA. Thank you, on county level prime age SSI applications and awards. We have county level caseload data for TANF from the 29 states that report universally to the HHS. That's not all states, obviously. Next slide, please. Now, our empirical strategy is to say, let's look at this X variable where you're open more months. So 1 year you open your waitlist more, and you are a PHA with a disability preference. This is going to be kind of a weighted average again, because it's at the county level and there could be multiple PHAs within a county. We're going to control for a bunch of other stuff like county level unobservables and a battery of fixed effects. Next slide, please. So our results show that having 1 more month open of a waitlist with a disability preference actually decreases SSI applications by 2.6%. We see a similar sized effect for awards, and we don't see any evidence of this lagged effect that it was what happened last year that's changing this. So we're not seeing any evidence of this longer run, but an immediate response to the waitlist opening. Next slide, please. We see a slight increase in TANF, but again, this is noisier because we have a smaller sample size, so we're not going to put a ton of stock into this evidence. Next slide. Now, finally, we wanted to throw a placebo test at this just to make sure that our results were valid. So we looked at all the counties with no disability preferences, and we show that having more months open does not change SSI applications or awards, and it's a close 0 estimate. Next slide. So finally, I'm just going to finish by saying we have some suggestive evidence here that an expansion in housing assistance could actually reduce reliance on other safety net programs, especially SSI, and it's kind of the relationship that we're seeing. Great, I think Jason Fichtner is up next, if he's not having technical difficulties.
That's it, we'll find out right now. Can you guys hear me?
Sounds good. Yes.
Perfect. So thank you, everyone. My apologies. As soon as Karen Glenn finished her remarks, my Comcast home internet decided to completely go offline, even though I restarted the router twice to no avail. So I am now on a hotspot. So we're going to cut the video to try to keep the audio quality as possible. In some ways, you should count yourselves as a blessing because you can see my ugly mug for the next 10 minutes. But I promise you, I did shave and dress for the event. We'll get through this quickly. Obviously, the disclaimer needs to be said that this is my opinions only, not that of the Social Security Administration, any government agency, any affiliation I have, or any person, past, present, future, living, or dead. Next slide, please. For many retirees, the home is their most valuable asset. A house is both used as an investment and for consumption. If a home is paid for at the time a person retires, they no longer have to service a mortgage or pay monthly rent, thus freeing up retirement income for other purposes. In this case, a large portion of income from Social Security can be devoted to consumption, benefiting the household standard of living in retirement. However, if a mortgage is not paid off, that creates a greater amount of mandatory expense that may threaten the ability of the value of Social Security benefits to replace income devoted to consumption in retirement. This data uses the Health and Retirement Study. Next slide, please. Quick selected literature review. Paying off a mortgage before retirement was once considered a rite of passage, as Michelle Singletary, the financial columnist for the Washington Post, noted, quoting, there was a time when people had mortgage burning parties to celebrate the day they were released from their biggest debt. My grandmother, Big Mama, longed for the day she would no longer have a mortgage albatross around her neck. Without a mortgage, Big Mama lived comfortably in retirement for more than 2 decades on Social Security and a small pension. She didn't have a retirement nest egg of 6 figures either. The albatross around the neck was this article. When I read it, is where I got the title and inspiration for this paper. However, mortgage burning parties no longer seem the norm. 37% of homes no longer mortgage attached to them. And recent surveys show that older Americans have taken on substantially more debt and face more financial insecurity as they near retirement. Next slide, please. This is the data analysis and results section. I'm just going to show you some highlights from the paper. There's a lot of data and a lot of charts in the paper, so I encourage you to download the full paper and results to get all the information you might be interested in. Next slide, please. Home ownership rates by birth year cohort. This is percentage. I used the HRS and I segmented households into 5-year birth cohorts. Those born in 31 to 35, 36 to 40, 41 to 45, 46 to 50, 50 to 55, and then 56 to 60. Home ownership rates for all cohorts declined after the 2008 Great Recession. The little square you see there is 2008. This analysis allows us to compare various cohorts at their ages at that time to see how various cohorts are doing relative to the others for an age group. The decline in home ownership rates was more pronounced for the younger cohorts, with those born in 56 to 60 exhibiting approximately a 17 percentage point drop in home ownership rates immediately following the Great Recession. For those born in 36 to 40, home ownership rates only slightly declined in the 2 years after the Great Recession. As the 2016 HRS, home ownership for each cohort remains below its pre-Great Recession level. Comparing the birth year cohorts at a specific average age is also illuminating, as both the 56 to 60 and 51 to 55 birth year cohorts exhibit less home ownership than the other older 3 cohorts. As retirement age households reach more advanced age, home ownership rates decline. Next slide, please. The home is an important asset in retirement, as I mentioned, and the HRS data include information on home and mortgage values, allowing for the construction of loan-to-value ratios. Home values for all age cohorts generally rise with the economy. However, each cohort experienced a significant reduction in the average value of primary residences as a result of the 2008 financial crisis. On the basis of averages alone, data from the 2016 survey show that none of the cohorts have recovered those losses in value since the crisis. Again, this is on average. The general pattern of decline are relatively uniform for each cohort, suggesting that any shock to the housing market could have a major impact on the financial well-being of retirees. Reassuringly, though, homeowners have continued to pay down their mortgages, as will be shown in the next slide. As one would then expect, the loan-to-value ratio has generally continued to decline, securing home value that might otherwise be at risk in a future shock to the housing market. Next slide, please. This is also in some ways very good news. The percentage of households that own their primary home and pay off their mortgage steadily increases with age. While the 31 to 35 birth year cohort generally exhibits higher levels of mortgage-free home ownership than other cohorts, the percentage of those that own their homes that have paid off their mortgage steadily increases with age. For example, for those in the 31 to 35 birth year cohort who had an average age of 83 in the 2016 HRS, almost 85% of those that owned a home had paid off their mortgage. The trend of paying off the mortgage was uninterrupted by the Great Recession. Although home ownership rates declined after the Great Recession, for those that maintained home ownership, they continued the trend of paying off their mortgage as they got older. It is unclear whether or not this trend will continue as a result of the 2020 economic recession. Next slide, please. In response to the Great Recession, the HRS added a few questions beginning in 2008 to study whether survey respondents had refinanced their homes in the last 2 years, and if so, why. These questions were only asked through the 2014 HRS, though. While the sample size is limited, there are only a few years of data. Some interesting observations are still worth noting. The older 1931 to 35 birth year cohort, who had average ages of between 75 and 81 during the survey period, exhibited the lowest level of refinancing. Between 11 and 13% of those in the HRS in the 31 to 35 year birth cohort that owned their home refinanced between 2008 and 2014. The youngest birth year cohort, 56 to 60, exhibit a consistent level of homeowners that refinancing during the survey period, near 20%. Interestingly, the middle birth year cohort all showed an increase in the percentage of those with a home that refinanced after the Great Recession. Next slide, please. I apologize for all the data on this slide. So I encourage everyone to download the PowerPoint so you can look at the detail look at the data in more detail. But this shows the reasons for refinancing by birth cohort. So the HRS asks you why to refinance. And there's some interesting information here. Again, I encourage you to download the entire thing, but I'll just read off some quick things for you given the time I have. A relatively consistent number of respondents across cohorts replied that they refinanced in order to reduce the amount of mortgage payments. Ignoring the 2008 survey year and just focusing on 2010, 12, and 14, the percentage of respondents that refinanced and replied they did so in order to reduce the amount of mortgage payments ranged from a low of 5.1% for the 1951 to 55 birth-year cohort in 2010 to a high of 21.9% for the 36 to 40 birth-year cohort in 2014. However, the number that chose this response was often in a much higher or tighter range of 10 to 14%. A very low percentage of those that refinanced did so in order to consolidate debt, with the exception of the 31 to 35-year birth cohort in 2008, and no other year for any other cohort did the percentage of people indicating they refinanced in order to consolidate debt reach 6%. The same goes for those that responded they refinanced in order to move to a fixed interest rate. At no point do more than 5.4% indicate that reason for refinancing in 2008. For refinancing. In 2008, though, 10.8% of those that refinanced in the 31 to 35 birth-year cohort, the oldest HRS birth-year cohort, did so to consolidate debt. The responses for the 2008 wave of the HRS at the time of the Great Recession are particularly noteworthy. In 2008, of those that refinanced in the 31 to 35 birth-year cohort, 37.8% indicated did so in order to raise cash for other things. This was the greatest response for this cohort in 2008. Similarly, it was also the greatest response for the 36 to 40 birth-year cohort at 42%, and the 51 to 55 birth-year cohort at 40.6%, and a close second for the 41 to 45 birth-year cohort, 29%. Next slide, please. And then I had left some sort of conclusions and discussions. Again, I apologize for all the data. There's a lot more in the paper. Whether or not homeownership housing debt in retirement is a financial asset that allows for consumption smoothing or an albatross around the neck of retirees requires a much more nuanced answer than either a yes or no. As a result of my research show, while the percent of homeowners paying off the mortgage before retiring has been declining with each new birth year cohort, for most retirees that own a home, they still tend to pay off the mortgage as they get older. Hence, the data suggests that older households are generally managing their home-related debt in retirement, thus delaying the age at which they are mortgage-free. The number of homeowners that refinanced to raise cash for other things was relatively low during the 2010-12 age. The number was high during the 2008 HRS, suggesting that homeowners refinanced upon completion. In times of economic recession, home equity is a financial lifeline for new retirees in retirement. We may see similar patterns as a result of the 2020 economic recession. Next and last slide, please. So similar to the narrative about whether there is a retirement crisis on the narrative that there is a home debt-related retirement crisis brewing because more homeowners are entering retirement with home-related debt creates an incomplete picture of the true financial landscape faced by many current and future homeowners in retirement. While some homeowners are over-leveraged, the research suggests that high credit card debt is more likely to cause financial distress and lead to bankruptcy than high home-related debt. As the current economic recession and health pandemic have shown, additional research is also necessary regarding racial, gender-based, or geographical disparities that can impact home ownership rates and financial well-being in retirement. Policymakers will need answers to these questions when considering how changes to Social Security's financing or benefits might impact financial well-being in retirement. Again, I apologize for all the data and for the internet connection issues, but look forward to the questions. And with that one, I'll go back to Tom for Q&A.
Okay, everybody did a great job holding to schedule. We have several questions from the audience, and then I might indulge myself if we have any time remaining thereafter. I should say 15 minutes after our panel ends, Ann Case will be speaking, and she holds a very special place in my personal history. When I was getting a master's and thinking about doing a PhD, she told me everything in economics is either this or this, which I have retained and thought about many times and use in teaching all the time. Okay, so the first question I'll ask goes to Carly, and that is, how do the HCV incentives interact with other HUD programs, such as Section 811 PRAC, or other NED vouchers? That is from Austin Nichols of APPS. Carly?
That is a great question. So when we were setting out to really look at all this policy variation, we started asking some PHAs a lot of questions, and we realized quickly that they wouldn't respond if we did that. So when we kind of expanded it, we limited what we were asking specifically about preferences. We are controlling for a host of other county level programs and number of units and that kind of stuff. I would love to be able to tell you about more of the interactions in housing assistance, but I'm sure, as you know, having worked in this field before, that it's a mess. So when I first started thinking about housing assistance, I was like, oh, there'll be a great measure of generosity and we'll be able to figure out what the complementarities are like that. Someone else will have studied this. But there are so many details. Like, the devil's definitely in the details with these policies, and the devil is large, let's say, in this capacity. So I'd love to talk more about that and think about other types of ways that these might be interacting.
Okay, terrific. I have a question from Tatiana Michete of Brandeis. I hope I got the name reasonably okay. For Gary and for Jason, any data on how the home ownership profiles differ, or mortgage payoff and refi differ by race and ethnicity? And Jason, maybe I'll throw in a related question I had, which is, are we getting a selection out of home ownership? Is it the highly leveraged who exit home ownership, so you get a artificially high rate of payoff? Or are the exits from home ownership early in or just before retirement sort of independent of the mortgage level?
Well, I guess I'll go first and go to Gary. To answer your question, from what I can tell so far, it's sort of independent. As home values rise, you get home equity, and so people sort of tap them, and same thing with interest rates. In the paper, you can see more data about how the interest rates have been declining historically over time, and that, of course, leads to an increase in refinancing just to get a lower mortgage payment or reduce the length of time which you have a mortgage. With the racial disparities, that's one thing I call for and did not in the paper that we're seeing today. Again, is I think to start off the RDRC conference today, all this research was before the pandemic, and now that the pandemic's here, we're sort of realizing that the racial disparities are a lot more evident, and we wish we had time to do it, and that might be the next paper that we put forward to SSA for funding to look at the racial issues and differences in housing, but that's also very important, obviously.
Yeah, the reverse mortgage data, I'll just say, is unbelievably, the last time I looked, the racial selection, you don't have borrower race, but I have a zip code, and it's so heavily in minority heavy zip codes. Gary,
yeah.
In your data?
It's something that we, in this version, like Jason's version, we didn't focus specifically on. There's a lot of moving parts in the paper. But let me say something that's really important about race in this context is that race is very heavily correlated with longevity. And so if you're thinking about the distinction between age, home ownership and age, and home ownership relative to the date of death, it's really critical to do it relative to the date of death, because in my figures, when I showed you those low home ownership rates among 90-year-olds and centenarians, those are predominantly older, higher educated white women that are living to those ages. So you really have to do it. This distinction of using the exit interviews and doing it by date of death is really critical when you're looking across races.
Yeah, Gary, speaking of your paper, and I'll have another question from the audience in a second. Do you have any sense further the extent you can distinguish now bequest intent from precautionary savings from a nursing home as a reason for retention of home equity or other assets? Because that's a sort of perennial question that people have stabbed at, but a tough one.
Yeah, one of the real difficulties is that a lot of these motives for holding housing are highly correlated, and they produce observationally equivalent implications for wealth. So what we do in the paper is we actually control for a wide variety of potential confounding factors. And those include your subjective probability of entering a nursing home. They include your subjective survival probability. They include eligibility for Medicaid. Do you pass the income and asset tests? Capital gains taxation, estate taxation. We have a large variety. Basically, we try to get all the other potential motives, including long-term care insurance, off the table. And even conditioning on those, the results are really, really robust. So we are very kind of confident that we've identified the impact of a bequest intention in a reduced form sense, not in a structural sense, but in a reduced form sense. Yeah.
And you said 25%. Should I think about it as 25% of the population really wants to give a lot to their kids, so they want to give the whole house, or should I think about most people want to give about 25% of their equity to their kids?
No, this is the aggregate. If we want to think about aggregate equity, when you give the house, you give the whole thing.
Yeah.
We want to think about so, for example, there's in 2012, there's $6 trillion in housing equity for individuals who are 62 and older. About 6% of that leaks out through mortality, so that's 370 billion. And of that, about 100 billion is bequeathed to non-surviving spouses, and about 80 to 90 billion of that 100 billion is intended bequests that are going to individuals. Those are whole houses. They're not partial houses. But if we want to think about the stock of wealth, yeah, that's the stock of wealth. So that 25% number is the aggregate stock of wealth. It's not as a fraction of homeowners. We are doing that in the paper as well. But yeah, that's what I meant to say.
Right. And then speaking of intended or definition of bequest, Michael Hurd asks, the HRS elicits the probability of a bequest, not the intended bequest. So in a stochastic environment, how does that affect what you're doing? Are these intended, or, looking at my probability of going into a nursing home before death, I'd probably stay otherwise?
Yeah. So the answer there is that I use those two interchangeably. We use the probability of bequest as we actually use it directly as our measure of intention. So when I talk about an intended bequest, I mean a high probability of leaving a bequest. It's and the details are in the paper. I meant in the interest of brevity, I didn't go into that definition, but that's what's meant. So the estimates I talked about, which were that if you go from having zero probability of bequest to the average positive probability of a $10,000 bequest, which in my sample is about 70%, that's associated with a reduction in the likelihood of an own-to-rent transition of 23 percentage points. So that's what I meant more specifically. So you go from no probability, I'm not going to give anything, to the average likelihood. Okay. Now let me say one last thing, which is that when we calculated the fraction of aggregate wealth that was intended bequest, we did it in three ways. We used estimates based on a $10,000 likelihood of leaving a $10,000 bequest, likelihood of leaving a $100,000 bequest, and we also did an alternative calculation using kind of more a medical-based approach, where we looked at exit interview questions on where did you die? Did you die in an unexpected or expected fashion? What was the duration of your final illness? And actually, the three methods line up remarkably similar. I was really quite impressed that. Usually you don't get that, but they were. So that leads us to believe that we really have kind of identified that well.
Excellent. Okay, I should stop us there. Thank you very much, Jason, Carly, and Gary. We now have about 14 minutes and 45 seconds until Ann Case's talk. So thank you very much. That concludes the panel.